This second video is about rectangles and squares. A rectangle is a parallelogram with 4 right angles. And I've drawn in 3 rectangles down here at the bottom, and you should be pretty familiar with rectangles. Now, as far as properties of rectangles, since a rectangle is a quadrilateral, it has 4 sides. The sum of the interior angles is 360. The sum of the exterior angles is 360. Okay, and it also has all the properties of parallelograms, meaning the opposite sides are congruent. The consecutive angles are supplementary, which should make sense because they're both 90 degrees. The opposite angles are congruent, which again should make sense because they're both 90 degrees. And the diagonals will bisect each other. Okay, let me point out that a rectangle is not a rhombus. So the 2 additional properties discussed in the last video won't necessarily apply to rectangles. Okay, and there's one more property about rectangles that you'll need to know. Okay, I've constructed here a rectangle, and just like rhombuses, the property has to do with the diagonals. So I've drawn the diagonals, okay, and you'll notice that the diagonals will stay the same length. Okay, and that's the thing you need to know about rhombuses, is that if a parallelogram is a rectangle, then the diagonals are congruent. Okay, now from what I've heard about construction, they build lots of rectangles, doors, windows, rooms, walls. Lots of rectangles are built using construction. And from what I've heard is that they actually do measure the diagonals of rectangles to make sure that what they've just built is a rectangle. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what I've heard. The thing you need to know about rectangles is that the diagonals are congruent. Now let's try a few problems to see how we will apply this property. And JKLM is a rectangle. I'll draw a picture, as pictures are often helpful for us. JKLM. If JL is 4x minus 12 and MK is x, what is the value of x? Okay, well, we just learned that the diagonals are congruent. So 4x minus 12 is equal to x. And I'll solve this equation. I'm first going to subtract 4x from both sides. Okay, divide both sides by -3, and x is equal to 4. So what's the value of x? X is equal to 4. What is the length of each diagonal? Well, since this one's equal to x, MK will be equal to 4. And JL, since it's congruent, will also equal 4. I could plug it back in the equation, but if I did, I would get 4. Okay, another question. L, M, and P is a rectangle. Let me draw the picture again. Ln, we're told, is 5x minus 8, and MP is 2x plus 1. Now, since it's a rectangle, the diagonals are congruent, and 5x minus 8 is equal to 2x plus 1. I will subtract 2x from both sides. 3x minus 8 is equal to 1. I add 8. 3x is equal to 9. Divide by 3. And x is equal to 3. It asks to find the value of x. I just did that. And the length of each diagonal. So I'll plug 3 back in to the simpler one. 2 times 3 plus 1 is equal to 7. And so they're both equal to 7. Okay, let's move on to a square. And a square is a parallelogram with 4 congruent sides and 4 congruent angles. Okay, now because it has 4 congruent sides, it's also a rhombus. And because it has 4 at angles, it's also a rectangle. Okay, so a square is a rhombus and a rectangle at the same time. Okay, so the properties of squares are all the properties of quadrilaterals. It has four sides. The sum of the interior angles is 360, and the sum of the exterior angles is 360. It's also a parallelogram. And so the opposite sides are congruent, which makes sense because all the sides are congruent. The consecutive angles are supplementary, which makes sense because they're both 90 degrees. The opposite angles are congruent, which makes sense because they're both 90 degrees, and the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, and a square is also a rhombus. So the diagonals are perpendicular, and the diagonals bisect the pair of opposite angles. Okay, a square is also a rectangle. Just move this up. And so the diagonals are congruent. Okay, so a square has all the properties of parallelograms, rhombuses, and rectangles. So let's use these properties to answer some questions. Find the values of the variables and then find the side lengths. So the thing you know about squares is that all the sides are congruent. Okay, so I can put any of these equal to each other because they're all congruent to each other. So I will pick y. I'll solve for y first, and these two look somewhat simple. So y minus 1 is equal to 2y minus 5. And I'll subtract y from both sides. And negative 1 is equal to y minus 5. Add 5 to both sides. Y is equal to 4. Okay? Which, if I plug this back in here, I get 4 minus 1, or 3. Okay? Now, because it's a square and all the sides are congruent, then all the side lengths are equal to 3. Okay. Now it also asks us to find the values of each of the variables. So I'll go back to find x by putting 2x minus 7 equal to 3, which gives a little backwards, but we need to find the value of x, so we'll do it. Add 7 to both sides. 2x is equal to 10. Divide by 2. Divide by 2. X is equal to 5. Okay, I found y and the length of each side. Okay, now is each parallelogram a rhombus, rectangle, or square? So I want to use the most specific name possible to identify these polygons. Okay, now in number 1, I know it's a parallelogram. Okay, so I know the opposite sides are congruent. So these are also congruent. Okay, so we know it's a rhombus. Okay, now I have one 90-degree angle. Okay, but because it's a parallelogram, the consecutive angles are supplementary, so this is 90, and the opposite angles are congruent. Okay, so these are also 90 degrees. And what I have here is a square. Okay, so it has to be a square. Number 2, all the sides are the same length, and this angle is not 90 degrees, which means this has to be a rhombus. Number 3, I'll call this number 3. Okay, these arrows mean that the sides are parallel. Okay, and the opposite sides are congruent, which is true for parallelograms. Okay, meaning that they're not all the same, so it's not a rhombus, it's not a square, and we can't tell if these angles are 90 degrees or not. So I would guess it's either none, or you can write just parallelogram because it's a parallelogram, but I don't think it's a rhombus, rectangle, or a square. Okay, number 4 is again a parallelogram. Okay, and I have 4 right angles, which means it's a rectangle. Okay, the last is about listing all the quadrilaterals that have the given property. So you choose among parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, and square. And just so it's faster for me to write, I'm going to call a parallelogram P, a rhombus RH, a rectangle an RE, and a square an S, just so I can write these faster. The opposite sides are congruent. Now that's true for all parallelograms, the property of parallelograms, and because rhombuses, rectangles, and squares are all parallelograms, they will have the same property. Okay, opposite angles are congruent. That's a property again of parallelograms. And so it's true for rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. Actually, on second thought, I don't want you to copy my notation when you do your homework. So let me go back and rewrite these out. This is parallelogram. Okay, consecutive angles that are supplementary. Again, that's a property of parallelograms, and so all four will have that property. Okay, diagonals are congruent. Okay, now that's not true for rhombuses because they could be longer. So the one that has congruent diagonals are rectangles. Okay, and each diagonal bisects opposite angles. Oh, I'm sorry. It's rectangles and squares also have this property because squares are rectangles. Each diagonal bisects opposite angles. Well, that's a property of rhombuses. Okay, and because a square is a rhombus, it's also a property of squares. Okay, and that wraps up the second video on section 6-4. You should know the properties of rhombuses, rectangles, and squares, be able to use those properties to write and solve equations, find missing measures in rhombuses, and identify which polygons have a given property.